I'm Maria Estorino. I'm Vice Provost for University Libraries and University Librarian here at Chapel Hill. And it's my great pleasure and also honor to welcome you to Historic Wilson Library as we open the new scholarship on the U.S. South Wilson Library Fellow Symposium. This capstone symposium celebrates the Southern Studies doctoral fellowships here at Wilson Library. Both the fellowships and the symposium today and tomorrow are generously made possible by a grant from the Watson Brown Foundation. Just want to make sure to thank them, even though they couldn't be here today. When I first joined the University Libraries in 2017, that was as Associate University Librarian for Special Collections here at Wilson Library. I saw very quickly that we had a really incredible opportunity to consolidate our existing fellowships into a robust program and that we could grow that program in exciting ways. And so again, I'm really grateful to Tad Brown and the Watson Brown Foundation for understanding that vision so clearly, so early, and supporting it really from the beginning with the grant that I mentioned. Since 2019, the grant has allowed us to welcome 57 fellows from over 30 different universities to our campus, some of whom you'll hear from tomorrow. I have to turn to the program for a quick minute because there's two things here. One is please make sure to look at the program for the schedule for tomorrow. And I hope you'll come back. You're welcome to drop in and out as your day allows. The other thing is that I made a mistake in my message to the university librarian where I said there were 49 fellowships. I missed a whole year. So it's actually 57. And that's really incredible, especially considering we had a pandemic in the middle of that, right? I'm sorry? Good mistake. Yeah, I'm glad it was trending in that direction, right? I also should say that we have had fellows from England, Scotland, and Ireland. I don't know, Southern studies, I guess, are big in the British Isles, but that's like I wanted to point that out as well. So the Southern Studies doctoral fellowships complemented our existing fellowships at the time. And really what we wanted to do was to target the core community of applicants that we were seeing for those fellowships, doctoral students and candidates, and supersize the opportunities that we can make available to them through increased funding and through more intentional engagement with our expert staff. It's really that combination, right? The collections are here and usable, but it's when you connect with our staff and their knowledge and their expertise, and frankly, their interest, their enthusiasm for your research questions, it really makes things happen in a different way. And that's what we were really striving for. These and all our fellowships are investments in the success of emerging scholars like the ones you'll hear from tomorrow, and other researchers we fund who are seeking to make meaningful use of the collections that we steward. They're a manifestation of our dedication, not just to the preservation and discovery of these collections, but to the innovative scholarship that they make possible. The program has also catalyzed the growth of our fellowships program at Wilson with the support of other individuals and organizations. This has included a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services to develop a teaching fellowship, which will run through next year. And in 2022, a $500,000 matching pledge from the William R. Keenan Charitable Trust to permanently endow a set of these research and teaching fellowships. Once the match is realized, the endowment will allow us to continue to provide scholars, students, artists, and other researchers with the financial and intellectual support necessary to really deeply and meaningfully engage and explore Wilson's historic collections and to produce the kind of scholarly work that generates both new understandings of our history and hopefully also visions of our shared future. So if you would like to find out how to support that, it's handily in your program if you would like to help us with that match in any way. So please take a look and learn more about it. So a program like this really takes a tremendous number of people to manage, and many of them are in the room. I hope you'll get a chance to meet them and talk to them. But tonight I need to extend some very specific thanks. Where is Matt Turry? Matt Turry, would you stand up? Matt is our manuscripts research and instruction librarian, as well as our fellowships coordinator. And he's been my partner in developing this program and running it really from the beginning. So Matt, thank you for saying yes when I was like, hey, you want to work on this with me? You didn't really know what was going to come your way, but you've done such, you really have been the heart of making this what it is. So thank you, Matt. Nadia Clifton, where's Nadia? Hey, Nadia. Nadia has provided support in so many different ways since becoming Special Collections Engagement Librarian in 2019. So thank you, Nadia, for all of the positive and creative energy you've brought to the project. Both Nadia and Matt, along with Allison Barnett, Katie Fanfani, and Elizabeth Ott, made up the core of the planning for this symposium, and you'll read more about more of the people involved also in your program. All right. So finally, I want to also extend really sincere thanks to our campus co-presenters, our longtime partners in the Southern Oral History Program, and our friends at the Center for the Study of the American South. They will be hosting a closing reception tomorrow at the Love House on Franklin Street. So hopefully, if you can't make it to anything else, come to that party. All right, so now it's my really great pleasure to welcome Raul Necochea Lopez to introduce our keynote speaker. Raul is Associate Professor of Social Medicine in the School of Medicine here at UNC, and also an Adjunct Associate Professor of History. His work focuses on the history of medicine and science, sexual and reproductive health, and Latin America. He's committed to bringing non-US voices and sources to bear on health and medical research. Raul is author of A History of Family Planning in 20th Century Peru, published by UNC Press, and La Planificación Familiar en el Perú del Siglo XX, published by IEP and the United Nations Fund for Population Activities. Raul is president of the Peruvian Society for History of Science, Technology, and Health, and is currently writing a book about the history of cancer care in the Andean region. He holds a master's in history of technology from Georgia Institute of Technology and received a PhD from McGill University in Canada. He's also, I believe, the faculty moderator for the Bullet Club. Is that correct? Yeah, which we collaborate quite extensively, the Bullet Club on the history of medicine here on our campus as well. So please join me in welcoming Raul Necochea Lopez to introduce tonight's keynote speaker. Thank you.
That was really sweet and above and beyond. Thank you, Maria. It's really a pleasure to be among friends here at Wilson Library. Good evening and welcome once again. Like Dr. Estorino said, my name is Raul Necochea Lopez. I'm a historian. I'm from Peru. I've been here at the School of Medicine for about 13 years now. And those are the most important bits about me. Tonight, it is a joy and an honor to introduce my friend, Dr. Richard Mizelle, whose work at the intersection of environmental history and chronic illness casts important and urgent light on long-standing health disparities that shape the lives of racialized communities in this country, while at the same time showing us that there are many different forms of strength and resilience demonstrated by these very same communities for decades. Dr. Mizelle is the author of Backwater Blues, the 1927 Mississippi River Flood in the African American Imagination, and co-editor of Resilience and Opportunity, Lessons from the U.S. Gulf Coast After Katrina and Rita. He has also curated an amazing traveling exhibit for the National Library of Medicine called This Lead is Killing Us, a history of citizens fighting lead poisoning in their communities. You can also find that online, by the way. A new project of his deals with diabetes, disability, and race in the 20th century. Another project involves a new baby. And Dr. Mizelle earned a BA in history from North Carolina Central University, an MA in history. Yeah. Go Eagles. An MA in U.S. history from American University, and a PhD in U.S. and the history of medicine from Rutgers University. He is now Associate Professor of History at the University of Houston, but keeps close ties here in the Tar Heel State. What better person to open this terrific symposium on new scholarship on the U.S. South? Here is Dr. Rick Mizelle to speak about reshaping the Great Migration and public health in the South.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I want to thank Elizabeth Ott, Matt Turry, and the Planning Symposium for this wonderful invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was thinking last week when I was putting the final touches on this talk, one of my first presentations was actually here at UNC. I was actually part of the SPGRE program in the same cohort with one of your colleagues, Cheryl Giscombe Woods, and we were in the same sort of cohort. And sorry, Cheryl Woods Giscombe, and I wrote a paper on maroon communities, sort of a transnational approach between the Great Dismal Swamp maroons and maroons of Palmeiras and Trelawney Town in Jamaica. And cover to cover, it was probably 35 pages, but in my mind at the time, it was 300 pages. It was the longest thing I've ever written at that particular time. And Professor William Darity was a part of this process. And we were all scared to death of Dr. Darity. And in some way, shape, or form, he asked us all how we define the term political economy. And all of these years later, I'm still not sure I can define political economy. But anyway, I'm very happy to be here and to talk to you a little bit about some of my ongoing research. I'm a historian of medicine, race, environment, and technology, but a lot of my work deals with movement. With my first project on the 1927 flood dealt with Creoles of color moving from Louisiana, from the Louisiana hinterlands into Houston as part of this migration trend. But also my work on environmental disasters. I'm also an environmental historian, and I deal a lot with displacement, with rootlessness, what Mindy Fullilove describes as root shock, right? What happens when the spaces around you change and are disfigured, and how does that sort of have a physiological impact on who you are as a person? And so I'm always thinking about these questions of movement. And so this talk tonight will sort of highlight some of those sort of lingering ideas. And I must admit, particularly the first part of my talk is a little bit sort of new, right? This is sort of part of a chapter that I'm working on, and I thought what better place to sort of think about some of these questions of the Great Migration and public health than this particular space. Sometimes that can be a little scary, but that's a dice I'm willing to roll. So I'm sort of thinking about some of these broader questions of the Great Migration and health as one theme for this talk, but also a particular moment which I've sort of recently tied into the Great Migration. And that is the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center, which I'll talk about in a moment. And the third sort of piece, which sort of runs throughout much of this conversation, is the concept of the archive and how we think about changes within the archive. And all of this comes out of my book in progress, which is entitled Running Sugar, Diabetes and the Politics of Running Sugar, Diabetes and the Politics of Race and Difference. And so, recently I've been thinking a lot about the Great Migration and sort of how we've come to sort of conceptualize this particular movement. And I must admit that, much of this talk, some of this talk is very figure heavy, meaning that I'm talking about sort of physicians and sort of well-known figures. And that's not usually how I sort of talk or how I write, but it's just how this particular piece is shaping up at this moment. But one of the historiographical shifts that I think is really needed within some of these conversations around the Great Migration are the ways in which people move for various reasons. In other words, people actually moved for education, right? People moving to places like Chicago to attend medical school or going to undergraduate in the sort of northern city. We don't necessarily think about that as part of the Great Migration. We sort of frame it within sort of sharecroppers going and working in industries and some of these other ways, but we don't necessarily talk about sort of the education that's part of the Great Migration. That's a narrative we often hear with immigration, right? With Eastern and Southern European immigrants coming into the country, but also Caribbean and African immigrants coming into the country, but not necessarily as part of the Great Migration. So I do think that there's some reshaping that is important for us to think about with these conversations around the Great Migration. So I want to start with a piece that was published several years ago now, which was very influential in terms of how people have begun to think about some of these conversations around sort of the Great Migration and public health. And the title of this, which was in an economic journal, The Impact of the Great Migration on Mortality of African Americans, Evidence from the Deep South, was interesting because they essentially make an argument that the Great Migration was awful for the health of Black people. And, they sort of in a roundabout way sort of talk about these questions of housing and sort of discrimination and racism. But the key issue that they're framing their argument around are the bad habits of sort of the migrants going into these sort of spaces. In other words, they drunk more, sort of used, sort of smoked more, were sort of using cigarettes. So alcoholism and smoking cigarettes were two of the reasons why they argue the Great Migration was unhealthy for migrants. And they use Medicare B records to make this argument. Now, Great Migration historians have often talked about the dangers of urban spaces, right? So the devices, but they also talk about sort of poor housing and racism and sort of lack of economic opportunities. What's been talked about less are sort of the chronic disease and even sort of lack of food choices and availability of healthy foods in some of these urban spaces. So the argument that their health was worse because of just sinful or horrible eating habits or the ways in which they smoke and drank is very limited in how we should think about this conversation of the Great Migration. Now, for many of us in this room, this sort of conversation is salient in many ways, right? So they highlight in this particular sort of essay a certain few states, right? They highlight South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi, which are part of what they argue the Deep South, right? So North Carolina is not included, Florida is not included, and Texas is not included. So, how we sort of define the Deep South or the deepest South is a question that's very important for this particular group. When I used to teach at Florida State, I would ask my students a question. I would ask, well, is Florida the South? And if you could have been present for some of those conversations, all of the kids south of Orlando would say, well, yes, absolutely. No, I'm sorry, all of the kids south of Orlando would say, no, this is not the South, right? Look at our culture, look at sort of immigration. And the kids north of Orlando would say, well, you need to look outside. This is clearly the South, right? And I would intend for this conversation to go on for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, but sometimes it would last an entire period because of the back and forth. And so these questions of what makes up the South are very, very important. But there are other sort of issues that I think sort of historians and scholars can raise about these conversations around the Great Migration. Sort of this lingering thought that I have about some of these sort of methodologies is sort of the notoriously difficult task it can be to completely evaluate someone's age who's born in sort of some of these southern spaces and some of these southern places. And so I think for many of us, we're really beginning to think about how we might sort of reconceptualize some of these broader questions of the Great Migration. But this essay was very, very influential. Some of these sort of headlines coming from NBC News and CBS. The Great Migration was awful for Black people's health. Great Migration shortened the lives of Blacks who fled the Jim Crow South. The other question is sort of chronic disease, right? How do we think about this narrative of chronic disease, not just possibly related to some sort of alcoholism or smoking, but also cancer, or in the case of the work that I do, diabetes. And so these are important conversations for us to think and to really sort of reshape some of these conversations. So, how we can rethink some of these ideas is to really broaden our understanding of what makes up the Great Migration. And part of the work that I do around Black health and chronic disease revolves around a number of different archives, but also figures. When you're researching particularly Black people in the Jim Crow South, it can be notoriously difficult to pull out sources. So I cast a wide net. And I think one of the sources or the body of sources that I think has been underutilized are Black insurance company records. And William Nickerson, who was founder of the Golden State Life Insurance Company records, actually migrated from Houston to Los Angeles. And when arriving in Los Angeles, found that the health of Black people was difficult. They did not have burial insurance. They did not have health insurance. And so he set out to found Golden State Insurance Company records with the impetus for helping sick people in need. And so William Nickerson, but also Robert Pershing Foster. You might remember this figure from the work of The Warmth of Other Suns by Abraham. But Robert Pershing Foster was an important figure because he migrated from Monroe. I'm sorry, Isabel Wilkerson. I'm sorry, Isabel Wilkerson is the author of The Warmth of Other Suns. But Robert Pershing Foster was a physician who, of course, moved from Monroe, Illinois, Monroe, Louisiana, to Los Angeles, California. And what's interesting about him is that he does not sort of follow the normal trajectory of sort of how we think about sort of the Great Migration, right? He drove to Los Angeles, and Isabel Wilkerson sort of talks about how he goes to Mexico for a few days and then sort of leaves Mexico and then drives through border towns, having a difficult time finding a place to stay, and eventually makes his way to Los Angeles, where he faces extreme prejudice from sort of white clients, but also Black clients as well. And so he's an important figure for how we might think about the Great Migration, because of his expertise, but also what he is sort of bringing to these particular spaces once he gets there. One of my colleagues and friends at the University of Houston, Helen O. Dickens, writes about the life and times of Helen Dickens. Amina Shakir is writing a biography of Helen Dickens, and Dickens was originally from Dayton, Ohio, but would move to Philadelphia, where she would become an obstetrician, a gynecologist, and would serve migrants from South Carolina and North Carolina. She was an advocate for teen health, anti-drug sort of abuse. And so she was an important figure as well in terms of sort of reshaping the Great Migration, and sort of how we might think of, importantly, how we might think of individuals migrating to certain spaces for certain kinds of care, migrating to sort of Philadelphia for gynecological care, or migrating to New York City for cancer treatment, right? So these are some of the questions that we're sort of thinking about. So this is an introduction for how I'm sort of starting to think about some of my own work. And I use Jackie Robinson often as an entrance into some of these broader conversations around diabetes, because in many ways he encapsulates much of what I'm doing with this project. Jackie Robinson, of course, desegregated Major League Baseball, played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And well known at the time was the fact that he was suffering from diabetes later in his life. In summer of 1972, Jackie Robinson was attending a dinner for a friend in Miami. Well known at the time was Jackie Robinson's sort of penchant for signing these detailed autographs, right? He would essentially write books and stories to people for autographs. But at this time, his eyes were hurting so bad, and he could not walk, he could not see, that he was unable to sign autographs. A few months later, he was back home in Stamford, Connecticut, and he was scheduled to attend an anti-drug seminar in Washington, D.C. Well known at the time was Jackie and Ruth's son's sort of addiction to drugs. He had recently sort of battled his addiction to drugs. It had lost his life in an automobile accident. But Jackie Robinson was very, very sort of upfront about his struggling with his diabetes, but also dealing with the death of his son. And so he was very much on the lecture circuit, going around to different places, sort of lecturing. And so he was scheduled to attend an anti-drug symposium in Washington, D.C., but his doctor pleaded with him not to attend. He was at this point bleeding from the eyes. His pain in his legs were so bad that he was unable to walk. And he died in August of 1972 from heart-related complications to diabetes. Now, this story of Jackie Robinson as a Black man suffering from diabetes was very much different from sort of the evolution of how we think about diabetes. Now, just as a way of context, I just want to give a brief sort of historical context of diabetes. Diabetes is an ancient disease. The first known reference to diabetes comes from an ancient Egyptian text known as the Papyrus. The term diabetes comes from the Latin word of siphon, as if water and urine are sort of moving through your body like a funnel. And for many of the centuries before the 20th, diabetes was known as a disgusting and painful disease where you would literally sort of devolve into a puddle of urine or a puddle of water. The secondary term mellitus comes from really a physician in the 17th century who, upon tasting the urine of a person with diabetes, responded that it tasted wonderfully sweet, as if imbued with honey. I can see some of your faces, but in the centuries before the 20th, the tasting of bodily products was one of the ways that physicians diagnosed disease. So that was not unusual. For much of for much of world history, diabetes was largely considered to be a disease of the heart. Until sort of understandings of sort of endocrine and endocrinology began to emerge in the late 19th, early 20th century. But at its core, diabetes is a B-cell pancreatic disorder. What we think of as juvenile diabetes is a moment in which insulin stops functioning in the body, stops signaling to the body to release sort of energy. And eventually, if it's not corrected, the body becomes insulin dependent. What we think of as type 2 or adult onset is when the insulin becomes resistant. And so the body continues to push insulin, but organs and cells within the body do not hear that signal. We also think now of what we might consider type 1.5 or mature onset diabetes or the youth, and latent autoimmune diabetes among adults, which is to say that there are individuals who are diagnosed with what we consider to be type 2 diabetes as children, and people diagnosed with what we think of as type 1 diabetes as adults, people age 40 and above. So all of that to say, how we think about sort of diabetes is complicated, and it sort of speaks to some of these broader conversations of the politics of disease awareness, disability politics, but also the complications of diabetes. And how do we think about a figure, an individual like Jackie Robinson, who is known for his sort of athleticism, suffering from the disability of this particular disease? And so importantly then, why Jackie Robinson is important, and then how this sort of ties into some of the conversations around the Great Migration, is that those of us who do the history of race in medicine sort of talk about how disease is used to create difference, right? So disease is used as a way to sort of construct what's considered to be biological difference, but then sort of defined as immutable, as sort of a proxy for this sort of race and racism that cannot be changed by social environments. And so similar to other diseases in the early 20th century, diabetes was considered to be largely a disease of whiteness, right? So the argument was that African Americans did not suffer from diabetes and could not suffer from diabetes because they were biologically incapable of suffering from diabetes, right? So you have this physician from 1898 writing that diabetes is a rare disease in the colored race. It was often considered to be a Judenkrankheit or a Jewish disease. William Osler, well-known physician, wrote that Hebrews seem especially prone to diabetes. W.H. Thomas defined Jews as a race with a greater propensity for diabetes, and the Hebrews, no doubt, are more commonly afflicted with chronic glycosuria than natives of the nation among whom they dwell. Part of the argument that they were making was that, the Jews were in this sort of civilizing process, coming to America, and the more sort of Americanized they would become, the more prone that they would be to diabetes, right? So this was part of the argument that they were making. Now, sorry, I keep looking down because it's cutting off some of it, but part of the argument that I'm making is not that Black people were suffering from diabetes in the early 20th century, too. That much is obvious, right? I can sort of pull out sort of tons of information about Black people suffering from diabetes. Part of my argument revolves around this sort of race-making project, right? So why and for what purpose did we use, or were people, scientists and physicians, using diabetes to create this racialized difference? And so then this sort of, revolves around ignorance making, or sort of what some scholars call agnotology. Why we don't know what we don't know, right? And so scholars have sort of talked about some of this dealing with the lead industry or the tobacco industry. And so there was a frustration, a silencing of information around sort of diabetes in the early 20th century, some of what, how Avery Gordon talks about ghostly matters, right? So the intimations, importance that we see in the archive that we can then use to sort of make these arguments. 1920s Metropolitan Insurance Company wrote in an annual report that the rate of diabetes among Blacks exceeded that of whites, right? Some scholars at Tulane made a similar case in JAMA. Looking at cases in New Orleans. A Baltimore physician in 1932 wrote of citywide morbidity at the Johns Hopkins Diabetes Clinic. And countering Osler's works, some wrote that, which had recently reinforced the common narrative of Black abnormality in diabetes. Aldo Leopold wrote that it is rather common today to hear usually well-informed physicians express this belief. So part of my book then sort of thinks about, in much the same way as movement of the Great Migration, right? How diabetes crosses the color line, right? How we sort of move from this moment of sort of racialized suppression and ignorance making to this moment within the era of the civil rights, where there is more awareness and sort of expertise around some of these moments. And so diabetes, I always make the case in the introduction and some of the talks I give, as a chronic disease, diabetes narrates the 20th century, right? It narrates the Progressive Era. It narrates World War I, Great Depression, New Deal, World War II, Civil Rights, Black Power. Right? There's no particular moment of the 20th century that diabetes does not touch. And so it makes sense that diabetes would then follow the trajectory of the Great Migration. So importantly, in this particular moment, and this is sort of important for some of the work I do as well, as a scholar who works on sort of Black people in medicine in the early 20th century, it can be very difficult to pull out some of these sources, right? So this is one of the few case records of a Black person that I've sort of come across. And this is sort of reported in the Johns Hopkins Hospital Bulletin, talking about Henry Roy, described as colored, aged 50 years, driver, or rather light-colored Negro, much emaciated. Now, that's important because they had to explain away those moments in which diabetes comes into the record. So the rather light complexion is important because essentially what they're arguing is that the closer they are to whiteness, the more prone they will become to diabetes. So it requires a jump in logic, right? As Karen and Barbara Fields say, a half-lit zone of the mind's eye, right? So these are some of the arguments that they're sort of making. The closer they are to whiteness, the more white blood supposedly they have in their bodies, the more susceptible they would become to diabetes. And some of these cases, these arguments were made among sort of Eastern and Southern European immigrants as well. And so I bring a lot of information into this narrative. I cast a broad net. And some of the most important sources I've used for this project include Black insurance company records, One of the first books I read a long time ago, Walter Weir's Black Business in the New South, and of course, Brandon Winford, who's another alum of North Carolina Central. That's right. His newish book, John Hervey Wheeler, Black Banking and Economic Struggle for Civil Rights. But Black insurance company records are very, very important. The Atlanta Life Insurance Company records, I've delved into those records. And what's interesting, and this is me talking a little bit about the archive, right? It's not that I'm going to find, or at least I haven't yet, just found a nice body of records on diabetes that I can pull. But sometimes when you're doing this work, you have to look around the periphery. You sort of look over here, and they might be talking about chronic disease. And in the midst of sort of holding this letter that Martin Luther King signed, that in my left hand, this actually happened. I just couldn't put the thing down because Martin Luther King actually wrote on this thing, right? So in addition to holding this, I'm flipping, and I see this document of a person who migrated from Atlanta to New York City because he did not think he could get the care he needed in Atlanta for his diabetes. And so that's part of the Great Migration too, right? So it's not just about sort of movement to one place and back. It's about this short-term movement, right? And to go back to the essay in which I started, scholars of the Great Migration have begun to push back on these certain trajectories, right? Of, Mississippi to Chicago, sort of South Carolina to New York City. But people like Bernadette Pruitt, right, who's sort of writing of sort of migration from Louisiana to Houston, or sort of the Texas hinterlands to Houston. And of course, even before that, right, Earl Lewis's book on migration to Norfolk. Right, so they migrated from Georgia and North Carolina to Norfolk for these industry jobs, but they also migrated from 40 minutes away to Norfolk for these industry jobs, right? And so, what you see with the Atlanta Life Insurance Company records is this, short-term migration, right? I don't know whether this person stayed in New York City or whether they returned, but the fact that there was a conversation about them going to New York City for chronic disease care, I think is an important part of what we're sort of defining here with the Great Migration. In a grant that I wrote some years ago, one of the critiques that I got when sort of using these life insurance company records was that, well, Black insurance company records are probably biased. I said, well, yeah, probably, but so are white insurance company records, right? So, it's sort of how we sort of think about these questions. But Black insurance company records were in many ways at the forefront of sort of defining diabetes, but thinking about diabetes care, right? They were among the first to actually print that this was an issue within Black communities. And so in this particular moment, Victory Life Insurance Company records recognition of their role in discovering diseases in their early stages and thereby aiding in arresting cures. James T.W. Granady, who was an alum of Howard University, immigrated from Grenada, I think, was very influential in terms of sort of raising awareness of diabetes in Harlem in New York City. Charged race mortality is misrepresented. United Mutual Benefit Company countered, importantly, white insurance company claims that Blacks suffered primarily from contagious diseases like tuberculosis and syphilis, but not diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. And so I charge all of you to really, who are doing this kind of work, to really not overlook Black life insurance company records. Which brings us then to a more distinct conversation of the Great Migration. And so I'm also an environmental historian. So I think about people, I think about places, I think about environmental sort of concepts. I'm also a historian of race and the environment. And so part of how I'm thinking about these conversations of the Great Migration revolves around this concept of race and place. Now, as many of you know, planners often attempted to suppress migration out of Southern spaces for a number of reasons. But physicians were also a part of this sort of effort to suppress migration. And they were a part of this process by essentially arguing that Black bodies were physiologically incompatible with northern spaces and northern climates, right? So it was not just that sort of the winters were cold and they had poor housing and those kinds of arguments, which they also made. It was that Black bodies could not survive in the North. And this was in many ways an old argument, right, that had sort of been made since slavery, and encapsulated in many ways in 1896 by Frederick Hoffman's Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro, in which he highlighted this sort of then common argument at the time that we were in this sort of biological warfare. And sort of writing under this concept of the extinction thesis, it was not uncommon for physicians and scientists to argue that in this era of biological warfare, that Blacks would become extinct in 30 or 40 years because they did not have the capacity for citizenship. Too many were migrating to the North, and they would die off in the coldness of the winters of New York, Chicago, Detroit. I want you to notice the date, and well, it's really hard for you to see it, but 1896, this was the era of Plessy. And part of these arguments were then made for Plessy versus Ferguson, which was sort of the moment in which segregation, Jim Crow, would spread throughout the American states. Samuel Chapman Armstrong, who was a zoologist at UC Berkeley, also highlighted this conversation of sort of extinction thesis, and was one of the individuals who articulated this idea. And so many physicians and scientists, in addition to planners, sort of use this idea to try and frustrate knowledge and frustrate movement out of the South. And so for many of you, I sort of rely upon, Black newspapers to sort of make some of my arguments, in addition to some of the archival research that I'm also pulling up. But some of these newspapers are really interesting and really important, right? So this particular piece, which I've often thought about, Negro Making Good in the North by Eugene Kinkle, just read just a piece of it. Negroes in the larger cities today have a lower death rate than in southern cities. In fact, they have a lower death rate in some northern cities than whites in some southern cities, quite contrary to the predictions of scientists during the close of the 19th century, that Negroes cannot stand the rigors of northern winters and the stern competition of northern industrial life. Eugene Kinkle, of course, worked with the Urban League, and this was in the Pittsburgh Courier. Another example, poor food, bad housing, and rigors of northern winters held responsible for high death rate. Talking about then Surgeon General Thomas Paran, he wrote that in general, the Negro has both a biological and an economic handicap in the struggle for existence. He has not built up immunity to respiratory diseases in the degree that the white man has, and it probably has not in the case of syphilis. A New York senator also chimed in, and his happy-go-lucky disposition may have something to do with it, right? So you see these narratives, right, within some of these conversations of the Great Migration, and it's important not to underestimate, right, how serious these ideas were, and their attempts to frustrate this movement and knowledge. And so part of what I do then as a scholar is sort of think about the breadth of some of these conversations, what people encountered when they got to these urban centers, and sort of how some of these conversations evolved. And so I think about individuals like U.G. Daly, Ulysses Grant Daly, who was from Donaldsonville, Louisiana, like so many others, migrated to Chicago and had a running column in the Chicago Defender where he talked about all things diabetes, right? He talked about foot management, he talked about staving off hyperglycemia, he talked about food, he talked about sort of trying to avoid amputations. And this was a steady column that you would see in the Chicago Defender throughout the 1940s and the 1950s. And so this is gold, right, for me, right, for some of the work that I'm doing, right? So how we think about these conversations and what they encountered when they moved into these spaces. Leonidas Berry, who was actually from Woodsdale, North Carolina, which is in Person County, near Roxborough, moved to Chicago as well, got his MD from Northwestern, and also periodically wrote about sort of chronic disease. In this particular moment, peptic ulcer and chronic disease, your health is wealth. In the 1970s, he's also known for this sort of program known as the Flying Medics, where he would fly medical supplies from Chicago to Cairo, Illinois, to a low-income community. And this was part of a long trajectory history as well of taking sort of needs to a particular community. I'm thinking in particular about the AKA Mississippi Health Project between 1935 and 1941, when they, for 6 consecutive summers, would go to Mississippi and sort of hold these wellness clinics, dental clinics, sort of giving out medicines and sort of trying to stave off infant mortality and inoculation against certain diseases, pushing back against tuberculosis and syphilis. And so this was, in many ways, a continuation of that work done by the AKAs and sort of other sororities and fraternities in the 1940s and 1950s. Again, he is from North Carolina, the South, and migrating for education. And all of that then is part of how we might rethink this concept of the Great Migration. Importantly, again, it's always a push to define, why something is happening in a particular space. So this is one of the earliest sort of pieces that I found on the Great Migration, and I didn't sort of include all of it, but in this particular piece by Eugene Leopold, Diabetes in the Negro Race, he's arguing that physicians in diabetes, and Johns Hopkins had a diabetes clinic in the 1930s and the 1940s, which I've been unable to track down the records. Medical records like that are notoriously difficult to find. I was looking at Cook County Hospital records once years ago, and they were literally in an abandoned building on the side of the highway in Chicago, right? And the cab driver dropped me off and said, well, this is it. And I said, this can't be it, but it was. And on the top floor were the Cook County Hospital records. But so this hospital records can be difficult to find, but that's the work we do. But in the 1930s and 1940s, particularly in the 1930s, diabetes specialists, public health officials were noticing an uptake, what they defined as an uptake of Black people suffering from diabetes in the city. And so their response to this, this realization was to blame migrants, right? So essentially what they argued was that, well, it's not the native-born Black Baltimoreans who are suffering from diabetes. It must be those newcomers coming from basically Maryland, right? Other parts of Maryland, on the other side of Washington, D.C. or Virginia, who are moving into Baltimore with their bad eating habits, with their bad genes that are skewing the rates of sort of diabetes within the city. So you see this sort of insider, outsider sort of narrative of the Great Migration, but also how these cities would blame migrants. And you see this for other diseases as well, but normally you see this for infectious diseases, right? So this is in many ways one of the first times you see this in terms of a chronic disease, sort of blaming the migrants who are coming into these particular spaces for the ill health. And so these moments in which I sort of find these types of documents are very important for the argument that I'm making around public health and the Great Migration. An important aspect of this work that I do also revolves around complications of diabetes, right? Amputations, kidney failure, retinopathy. Part of what separates the work that I do from other scholars who've written about diabetes is my sort of dogged insistence on thinking about the complications of this particular disease, which have been very well known for much of the 20th century. And so this particular piece, on January 4th, 1934, talked about of what shall diabetics die. And we're talking about really amputations, but also sort of kidney failure as well. And the other complications that individuals with diabetes are suffering from. And so this is another way for me to think about the Great Migration and how I've come to sort of understand this particular moment. One of the articles that I'm currently working on, which is in the pipeline, is a history of the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center. Now, this image from Life magazine is one of the sort of early dialysis machines. The machine looks scary, but that is the early dialysis machine. Dialysis would become normalized or would become part of rarely of sort of treatment of chronic kidney disease, or what was then often known as Brice disease, in the 1940s, right, in Peter Bent Hospital in Boston. So chronic kidney failure was a significant complication to diabetes, but also a disease on its own that many people in the United States suffer from. But dialysis was an expensive proposition in the 1940s, right? And somewhere around 1 in 300 people would access dialysis in any given moment. It cost about $20,000 per year for treatment, which, as you can imagine, was an astronomical figure. And so it was rare. It was clunky. It took up a lot of space. People didn't really think it worked. And so only a few hospitals throughout the country sort of utilized the dialysis machine. So I became interested in this narrative, a story around Seattle Artificial Kidney Center in Seattle in 1961 and 1962. The Seattle Artificial Kidney Center was the first outpatient dialysis clinic in the country. But they had a problem, like many cities. Seattle was a city of robust immigration, of migration. Boeing was there, which brought sort of migrants to the city. But there were too many people who needed dialysis and not enough dialysis machines. And so the Kings County Hospital made the controversial decision to institute what was essentially a civilian lay committee to decide who would gain access to dialysis and who would be left to die. Now, to say that this was controversial is putting it lightly, right? This was a significant bioethics, question. Like most medical students trained in the 1970s, as Raul knows, were sort of, taught this particular narrative as a medical bioethics issue. It was at its core an issue of supply and demand medical capitalism. But as you can imagine, there are problems with this, right? And so there are tons written about the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center. And there are tons written about this particular lay committee. But my focus is on sort of pushing the racialized, conceptualizations of this committee, which were mostly white, all white, mostly middle class, professionals within the Seattle community. And so they then, most of the people who were chosen for dialysis were white, were heteronormative, and were sort of considered to be a strong figure within the community. And so part of the argument that you get from people who've written on this was that race was not an issue because Seattle had a small Black population. And so that's where the Great Migration comes in, right? And that's where I sort of begin to push back on some of these conversations, right? Seattle, as many of us know, was a city that was complicated. It was never Chicago, but there was a strong Black population in Seattle. But the conversation also revolves around what does it mean to be a person who was of public service, right? And that's what was often used in some of these conversations, right? And none of these conversations were as poignant as one UCLA sort of article published in 1968, Medical Advance in Legal Lag, Hemodialysis and Kidney Transplantation, in which they argued, well, would civil rights workers jailed in the South be considered someone who's doing a public service, right? So many of the criteria that were used to choose would be sort of these questions around, well, are they church members? Are they sort of gainfully employed? There were medical criteria. They had to be between the ages of 15 and 45. Having children was a benefit. Having more than one child was a benefit. Being single was essentially a death sentence. So being married, having multiple children who were young, and being white and being middle class, um, attending church, having your children part of the Boy and Girl Scouts, those were the criteria that would make it most advantageous to receive a spot for the dialysis center, right? So these questions present very serious ethical issues. Would being civil rights workers jailed in the South or part of the Anti-Vivisection League, would those sort of participations result in being sort of called into the dialysis clinic? And so this is part of the archival work that I do, right? And many of you are familiar with this work. Marissa Fuentes, Dispossessed Lives, Michelle Ralph Trulia, Silencing the Past. And so I think about the face of archives, right? Suppression of experience, right? Accumulation of voices, creation of archives, and the continuation of marginalized and oppression in historical narratives. And this is part of where this work around sort of silences and intimations importance, right? It would be illogical to think that there were not Black people in Seattle who were suffering from dialysis. But why don't we know this? And why are we not sort of writing about it? And why is this not part of sort of the ethical ramifications of sort of how we're thinking about this particular moment? Like many of you, my introduction to Black Seattle comes through Quintard Taylor, right? Much of what I know about Black Seattle comes through the work of Quintard Taylor, who wrote that for many people, Chicago was not the final destination. New York was not the final destination, that Seattle was the far north, the last best place to try and achieve this freedom. And Seattle was, again, no Chicago, but there was a growing, robust Black population in Seattle by the 1950s and 1960s, including a chapter of the NAACP in 1913, Urban League in 1930, Civic Unity Committee in 1944, and one of the first Black Panther Party's chapters outside of California in 1968. And so, like many of these sort of migrants in other places, they were coming for industry jobs, but experienced extreme segregation in Seattle, right? In terms of hospital care, in terms of sort of residential segregation, Seattle was in many ways a hyper-segregated environment. And so some of this research I used to sort of highlight these moments, right? And there were several hospitals in Seattle which either refused admittance to those who were Black and ill, or did so on a segregated basis, or did so only if there were space available. But this example here was sort of fairly common as sort of the head of the Civic Unity Committee writing to Virginia Mason Hospital in 1946. In regards to our policy, we do not accept Negroes, Japanese, etc. So, one of the things I sort of was thinking about, and sort of some of the pushback I received for this work is, well, and I often get this with this kind of work that I do, which is to say that, we think you're right, but we don't think you can prove it, right? Which is sort of the onus that sort of scholars who do this kind of work often have to deal with. Which means that we have to look in unexpected spaces. We have to look in sort of archives that others do not necessarily think about. But sometimes the records are right there, but people have chosen not to look at those particular records. And actually, this is an example of the latter, right? So when I was researching this particular sort of part of this article, and the Belding Scribner papers at the University of Washington Special Collections, there was a box that looked very dusty, like no one had looked at it in years, that said Kings County Death Records. And so I asked the archivist if I could look at them, and it's the death records, which are kind of fall under patient records. So I had to go through IRB, and I had to get special permission, write a letter, all of those kinds of things. But they gave me permission to look at this body of records. And it changed how I thought about this project. And it sort of spoke in many ways to this sort of broader conversation of the Great Migration. The Great Migration was kind of percolating in the back, of my mind as I was sort of thinking about these ethical issues around the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center. But these death records, I think, really sort of highlighted many of these issues. And so this final portion of this talk revolves around that. And just another sort of final example of someone who migrated. Lloyd Elam, who was from Little Rock, Arkansas, was the first Black person to receive an MD from the University of Washington. He will go on to head the psychiatry department and actually develop the psychiatry department at Meharry Medical College and serve as its president from 1968 to 1981. Another sort of important example of sort of migration politics. But these King County death records are important, right? And so remembering that you had to be between 15 and 45, they thought that people who were under 15 were not mature enough to deal with the rigors of dialysis. Those over 45 they thought were too old, would probably have underlying conditions. And in fact, you could not have diabetes, cancer, you could not have heart disease. You could only have chronic kidney disease to be eligible for dialysis. And so these sort of death records are very interesting and important for how I'm thinking about these concepts, right? And I've scratched out the names because these are sort of records, and it's sort of prudent as historians of medicine to not identify individuals on these death records. And so in my work, I sort of changed their names to pseudonyms. But this particular person, who would not have been eligible for dialysis under the guidelines, born in Jacksonville, Texas, right? Migrating to Seattle for reasons that we could probably never know, died without medical assistance at the age of 55. Another person born in Shreveport, Louisiana, also outside of the age parameters at age 61. Many of these individuals died between 1 month after being diagnosed to living with 30, 40, 50 years with this chronic disease. Also in Seattle, city of residence, Seattle, died at the University of Hospital in Seattle. Another person, a woman, died in New Orleans, or place of birth, New Orleans, Louisiana, age 56, migrated to Seattle. Importantly, these records sort of show, not just that there were sort of, this robust migration into Seattle, but also the difficulty would have been to be recommended for dialysis, right? To be recommended from dialysis, you had to, be recommended by a physician. In other words, you had to get a referral from your physician to the dialysis committee to even be evaluated for this life-saving technology. And in a segregated space like Seattle, that was increasingly difficult. This person was born in Mississippi, age 80, immediate cause of death, uremia, died in Maynard Hospital in Seattle. And another person born in Little Rock, Arkansas. This person, as you can imagine, was interesting because born in Raleigh and migrated to Seattle. He was a long way from home. Died at the age of 78 and just 1 month after being diagnosed. But these individuals would have been eligible for dialysis. Sort of, again, birthplace in Texas, age 42, which is under the cutoff, died of uremia at Providence Hospital. Place of birth, Arkansas, age 38. And so these records I use to make the argument of the importance or the salience of sort of racial discrimination in places like Seattle, in particular with the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center, but also the importance of the Great Migration. Again, Texas, as place of birth, died at the age of 37. And so, and finally, another person born in Texas at the age of, dying at the age of 44. These questions, I think, are critical for how we think about ideas like the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center. Because without sort of an understanding of the Great Migration, we cannot conceptualize sort of how these particular moments are racialized in this particular space. They were moving to Seattle in droves in the 1950s and 1940s for Boeing industry jobs. Boeing was segregated until around 1950, 1951. But thinking about the work of Quintard Taylor and thinking about these primary source documents sort of allows me to sort of make this sort of broader argument of how we need to rethink these conceptualizations of the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center as not dealing with race because of a sort of low Black population in Seattle. And so the Great Migration sort of changes things, right? It allows me to make this argument in ways that other scholars have not. And I'll end with one of my favorite quotes from Octavia Butler, which is that there's nothing new under the sun, but there are other suns, right? So Great Migration is a moment in which we've not written everything that we need to write about it. There are new trajectories that need to be discovered. I don't think I have the bandwidth to write it, but I think there's a wonderful sort of book on the Great Migration from Louisiana and Alabama to Las Vegas. I even have a title for it, Gambling for Freedom. If you write it, just credit me, because actually, down the strip, sort of down by where the Stardust used to be. I don't know what direction, but to the left of the strip was an old community that used to be sort of filled with residents from Alabama who migrated to Las Vegas in search of industry, gambling jobs. Many of them locked out of some of the higher paid dealer and sort of positions in Las Vegas and relegated to menial positions as they were in many other cities. But how we think about the Great Migration changes these broader conversations of environmentalism, changes these broader conversations of politics, and changes how we think about Black history as well. Thank you.
There you go, Rick. Thank you so much, Rick Mizelle. That was amazing. Also, may I just point out that that whole talk was done without a single note. You may have noticed that. I noticed that because I was on the first one. Amazing. Thank you so much for this. The floor is open. We have time for questions from all of y'all. You're welcome to that. Our colleague Matt Turi is in the back with a microphone as well, and I'll be glad to MC for a little bit longer. And Rick, for as long as you'll have us.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, please. Wait, maybe use the phone because we're doing a recording.
Oh, of course. Thank you. I was just wondering, could you tell some of the efficacy of these treatments, especially of sort of African-American doctors and communities? Was it sort of on par with the efficacy of treatments by sort of white doctors for white communities? Or what did that sort of look like in the sort of, the back end of treatment?
So the efficacy of the dialysis treatments?
Of any of these sort of medical interventions that they were advocating, or in the column, the Chicago newspaper column, any of those sorts of things.
Yeah, well, I think that they were, responding to the needs of the migrants and sort of as part of, urban league chapters within some of these cities. But they were also, I don't know if this is working. They were also very much sort of pushing for medical treatment, right, through traveling clinics. I think that there's certain things that you always see within some of these conversations, right? Pneumonia, sort of influenza, sort of dealing with those issues. But I also think what's important is sort of the conversations around dealing with cancer. and getting treatment for cancer, and sort of moving into certain spaces like Providence Hospital in Chicago. And so this was, particularly in the 20s and 30s, this was the progressive era, right? So they were sort of really pushing for sort of the health of migrants as a way of protecting themselves, but also protecting the health of, in some ways, middle-class Blacks, but also the entire community. And so the treatment was there, but it was still difficult to access, based on, lack of insurance, but also lack of money to deal with sort of the diseases that were impacting people. But I think these physicians and also nurses, right? Part of what I argue in my work is that we have to decenter physician voices, which I say that, but everything I talked about here were physicians. But so, but for much of the 20th century, Black people were much more likely to encounter a nurse than they were a physician. And so part of that revolves around sort of diets and dietitians. And I was having a conversation with someone who was, I think she was an archivist who was sort of doing work on pulling up archives at HBCUs. And sort of one of my sort of thoughts was that, North Carolina Central had a department of human ecology. Was it human ecology or might not have been human ecology, but some of these sort of departments, which home economics, right, which sort of revolved around diet. I think some of those sort of records and archives would be, if they're able to be pulled up, would be so invaluable to some of the work we're doing, because all of that revolves around sort of efficacy. It revolves around treatment. It revolves around how to deal with sickness and illness in certain communities and certain spaces.
Thank you. And also, sorry for the awkward passing you of the mic. I only did it because our colleague Nadia Clifton was gently nudging us to, take a seat.
Oh,
but we don't
okay.
have to.
Okay,
I'll
I'm sorry.
go sit with you if you want to. But yes, please.
What difficulties have you encountered in locating and gaining access to? You mentioned some that were dusty and sort of deteriorating. Have you run into other barriers other than the simple loss of archives?
Yeah, I mean, no more than most of the people in this room, right? But medical records like Joslin archives were notoriously difficult to access. I had to get basically a letter of introduction. I was telling Raul from a colleague to get access. But I think more importantly, it is looking at those archives that are off the beaten path and that other scholars don't necessarily think about. I often wonder about this Kings County death records, because it was almost like somebody wanted me to find it. It was just so nicely put there, right? And nobody else has ever talked about it. I mean, I might be a conspiracy theorist, but it was, and most of them were of sort of Black people who had died in Seattle. Not all of them, but it just sort of speaks to sort of the politicization of archives and sort of how we go about doing this work. But it's I've been doing work on this project for really 10 years now. It's time to really wrap this book up and just write it and publish it. But I think that sort of the federal sources, can be easier, but sort of these sort of local sources that you have to sort of pull out of different spaces can be difficult. And I think for me, the biggest difficulty I've had really for this document, for this particular book, is just the disorganization of sources, right? In some of these sort of places, right? Where you'll go and they'll give you the key to a room, and it'll be a room full of boxes that are not organized, and they'll say, well, have at it. And I'll just say, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and I'll just start looking at stuff. And it's really just the luck of the draw. But that's part of the game, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, there's one more, and I'm afraid that will have to be our last question for the evening.
Okay, I'll try to make it a good one. So I was wondering if if dialysis becoming covered under Medicaid, I believe in the late 60s, if that improved access to dialysis for Black patients in Seattle or anywhere else.
Well, it's funny you asked that. So this article that I'm working on, or that's sort of in the pipeline, is really one of two pieces that I'm working on. Right? So I have this Seattle Artificial Kidney Center, which roughly goes into the 1980s, because even into the 1980s, there were rumors that this lay committee was still choosing or deciding who would have access to dialysis. So there was this fear, even among residents in Seattle in the 1970s and 80s, that their fate would come down to this sort of anonymous committee who would choose whether they would live or would die. But the second half of this, which I'm working on for a edited collection, goes from 1972, Medicare Dialysis Entitlement Act, which you're referring to, all the way through the current moment and sort of evaluations of estimated glomerular filtration rate evaluations, which is the argument that Black people are more muscular and therefore should be evaluated differently in terms of kidney disease, which is wrong, which is sort of rooted in sort of pseudoscience and scientific racism, but it's still common. And sort of some hospitals are now starting to reevaluate the use of sort of racialized diagnostic tools as part of Black Lives Matter and some of these other movements. But to more directly answer your question, dialysis entitlement made dialysis a disability, and it made it accessible. But then geographic racism also plays a part as well. So part of the argument that I make for this second essay is that dialysis is mostly dominated by for-profit dialysis clinics for Fresenius and DaVita, right? 80% of the dialysis clinics you'll see out in the U.S. are DaVita, Fresenius. U.S. Renal Care is a distant third. And so, particularly in the South, again, right, this deepest South, what represents the South, you'll see these conversations of people who might have to go, 2 towns over or an hour for access to a dialysis clinic, a dialysis care. And so while the Medicare Act made it technically more accessible, there's still barriers. And these barriers include transplantation, because you have to go through a dialysis clinic to get to the dialysis, to the transplant list for a kidney. And so if your experiences in sort of DaVita or Fresenius, if you don't have access to that, or you're sort of discontinued from that care, then it's essentially impossible for you to get a transplant. So it moved it from sort of inaccessible because of sort of a lack of medical resources to inaccessible due to geographic racism in place. And so, those are the moments in which, we continue to think about sort of questions of place and race as well.
Okay, I'm gonna exercise MC privilege to just do one more question.
Hello. Thank you for sharing your research with us. I was wondering, I had 2 questions, so this is the most unfortunate MC privilege you could have given to someone, but it's okay, I was wondering, when you talked about the Virginia Mason Hospital records and thinking about their denying all sorts of minorities or like racialized groups, are you thinking comparatively around, especially in the West, like tribal communities or indigenous communities experiencing medical racism in the same kind of like urban migration patterns from like reservations to the city and like all of that overlap at the same time? And then I'm also wondering, are you finding any sources of like community organizing around treating chronic diseases, like just more like folk medicine, or like thinking about like herbalism and like just especially like Black matriarchal like medical care that's coming out of like families in the South? So
yeah.
Take your time, but also I know we're running out of time.
Yeah. For the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center, no, those are great questions. Mostly dealing with Black people in Seattle, but also with Asian communities, sort of a large Asian community. But one of the sort of the earliest sort of examples of sort of dialysis was a person in Seattle named Ernie Crowfeather, who was a member of an indigenous group, who experienced quite a bit of discrimination and racism in terms of his quest for dialysis. People thinking that he was not worthy of dialysis due to his not being white. And so, you know, Seattle is a space in which you sort of think about sort of all of those sort of moments and all of those questions. For my particular project, I'm mostly dealing with sort of migration of Black people from parts of the South. You know, there's so much about the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center I couldn't get into for this talk, but they're like eugenic, like, you know, sort of conversations around like who is, you know, acceptable and eligible, right? You know, if they looked at your parents, they looked at your siblings, if your parents were considered to be indigent, then that was a strike against you. You know, as sort of as the two authors from UCLA wrote, being creative, not being white was put you at the bottom of the heap, so to speak. As one of them wrote, you know, being Henry David Thoreau with bad kidneys was no place to be, you know, in Seattle, right? You know, as far as sort of indigenous knowledge for my book on diabetes, you know, I think about these questions around, you know, community groups, you know, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, really. And most recently, that's what I'm thinking about in terms of sort of conversations around type 1, right? And so this was not fully a talk on diabetes, but there was this sort of conversation around Black people, particularly by the 1950s, and sort of the evolution of autoimmune disease. I'm sorry, but I'm gonna wrap this up. The evolution of autoimmune diseases in the 1950s, there was this sort of argument that you know, what was then considered to be thin diabetes was a white disease, and sort of obese diabetes was a Black disease. And so then having a Black disease, or what was considered to be a disease of obesity, was due to bad eating choices and bad habits. And so what that resulted in is that even today, there's sort of this misconception that Black people don't suffer from type 1 diabetes. And so part of what I'm dealing with is sort of thinking about the mobilization around sort of Black people with type 1 diabetes who are sort of pushing for an existence within their own, you know, sort of communities of those individuals suffering from type 1 diabetes, but also sort of managing some of their symptoms, which are often ignored, right? So the American Diabetes Association actually sort of put together a platform for Black people with type 1 diabetes, and they received quite a bit of pushback from sort of white individuals who were type 1, suffering from type 1 diabetes. And so that's one example of these sort of local organizations of Black people suffering from type 1 diabetes who are sort of mobilizing around their community to deal with their particular disease. You see the same thing with sort of Asian communities, right? There's a misconception that Asians don't suffer from diabetes, sort of this perception because they're small and thin that they don't suffer from diabetes. But if you look, you'll see quite a bit of mobilization in community groups, particularly in New York, and you'll see this around the Juvenile Diabetes Association in 1970s and 1980s, around certain communities in certain spaces that are mobilizing around that particular space. So to answer your question, yes, but that conversation in my project is a little bit later, perhaps, than other conversations in other books. I'm sort of really thinking about that for the last chapter and even the epilogue. But I do think that those are important conversations to be had as well.
Thank you so much once again, Rick.
Appreciate it.
And with that, I hope you enjoy the symposium tomorrow, and have a great evening, everybody.